If you stood at the edge of medieval Edinburgh for just 10 seconds, you would understand something most history books never tell you. It was not silence that defined the city, it was smell. The air was heavy before you even crossed the boundary of its narrow streets, thick with a constant mix that seemed to cling to stone and cloth alike, as if the city itself had been steeped in it for generations. People arriving for the first time often thought they would adapt, that any place could become normal once you lived in it long enough. But medieval Edinburgh broke that assumption almost immediately. This was not a city designed around comfort or freshness. It was a city built within stone walls, pressed tightly together for protection and survival, where every household, every market stall, every animal pen existed within walking distance of the next, and nothing was ever truly removed from the space it occupied. To understand why no one escaped the smell, you first have to let go of the idea that there was anywhere for it to go. Edinburgh sat on uneven ground shaped by wind and cold rain, its streets narrow and winding, its buildings made of timber, stone, and earth, stacked close enough that sunlight reached the ground only in thin, broken lines during parts of the day. Inside those boundaries, daily life unfolded in ways that modern senses would struggle to process. Water was drawn by hand from shared wells, carried in wooden buckets, and used carefully because every drop required effort. Waste from animals and households was not managed by invisible systems beneath the ground as it is today. Instead, it remained part of the visible world, moved by weather, gravity, and human habit rather than infrastructure. Markets formed the heartbeat of the city, bringing in fish, grain, livestock, and goods from surrounding regions. And with them came the layered presence of organic life constantly in motion, constantly decaying, constantly being replaced. Smoke from open hearths drifted through the streets, especially on colder days when every home and workshop kept fire burning for heat and cooking, and that smoke never truly left. It simply settled into fabric, hair, and wood. Yet even this explanation does not fully capture what residents themselves experienced, because for them, smell was not a single sensation but a background condition of existence, something that marked time and place more than clocks or calendars ever could. A butcher knew the rhythm of his trade by the air outside his stall, a baker by the shift of smoke in the morning wind, a traveler by the moment the city's scent returned after miles of open road. Outsiders often assumed this was simply neglect, a lack of awareness or care, but the truth was more complex and far more human. Medieval Edinburgh was not unaware of its own conditions. It was constrained by them, shaped by limits of water, technology, and space that defined every decision made within its walls. And so the question is not why the smell existed, but how a city full of living, working, breathing people learned to move through it every single day without ever being able to step outside of it. The first mistake most visitors made was assuming the city would become easier once you stayed longer, that human senses would simply adjust the same way people adapt to cold water or a steep climb. But medieval Edinburgh did not offer that kind of comfort. What changed over time was not the city, but the mind experiencing it. New arrivals would often step through the gates expecting a gradual adjustment period, a slow fading of discomfort as familiarity set in. Yet what they found instead was a constant baseline that never truly disappeared, only became easier to ignore in moments when attention was pulled elsewhere. Locals did not describe the city as fresh or clean or acceptable. They described it as normal, and that distinction mattered more than outsiders realized. Because normal does not mean pleasant, it only means expected. To understand how people lived inside this expectation, you have to follow a single day from beginning to end, not as a list of events, but as a continuous immersion through space and movement. At dawn, the city did not wake in silence. It woke in layers. Smoke from overnight fires lingered low between buildings, thickened by cool morning air that kept it close to the ground. Doors opened slowly, releasing sounds of wood, movement, and early labor. Water carriers began their routines, walking familiar paths to wells that served multiple households, their buckets striking against stone rims as they filled and lifted, each motion part of a rhythm that repeated every single day without interruption. Animals were already present in the shared spaces, not as separate elements of the city, but as part of its structure, moving through streets, markets, and courtyards as naturally as people did. Nothing in this environment was fully separated, which meant nothing ever fully disappeared. As the day developed, markets became the center of activity, drawing people into tighter spaces where goods were exchanged and conversations overlapped with the sounds of trade. Fish, grain, leather, and cloth all passed through the same narrow corridors, and each material carried its own presence into the air. Heat from bodies and cooking fires mixed with damp stone and wooden structures, creating an atmosphere that shifted slightly with weather but never fully cleared. Even wind, which in open landscapes would have brought relief, here only moved conditions from one street to another without removing them. Yet within this environment, people developed a precise awareness that outsiders rarely understood. A resident could identify the time of day not by sunlight alone, but by changes in movement, by which streets grew crowded first, by which stalls opened earlier, by how smoke drifted differently, depending on fuel and weather. Children learned to navigate routes that avoided congestion, merchants learned how airflow affected their goods, and craftsmen adjusted their workspaces according to light and ventilation that changed hour by hour. None of this eliminated the constant presence of the city itself, but it created a system of adaptation built entirely on coexistence rather than separation. Still, beneath this adaptation, there remained a question no one needed to ask out loud, because everyone already knew the answer in practice, if not in words. If the city never truly cleared, never fully reset, never offered a moment of complete absence, then what exactly were its people learning to live with, and what part of that life was shaping them in ways they no longer noticed at all? The answer was not something a single person in medieval Edinburgh could easily point to, because there was no single source, no central place where the city's condition began or ended. Instead, it came from everywhere at once, like a slow accumulation of ordinary decisions that never fully left the environment they shaped. Waste from daily life did not vanish once it was produced. It followed gravity, rain, and habit, moving through gutters cut between buildings or simply into open ground where time and weather were expected to take care of it. But time did not remove it in the way modern systems do. It only transformed it, breaking it down into new forms that stayed within the same narrow boundaries of the city. Rainstorms helped for a moment, washing streets into temporary clarity, but they also carried everything downhill into lower areas where it collected again, waiting for the next cycle of movement and disturbance. The River of Edinburgh, like many urban waterways of the period, was both a resource and an endpoint, receiving everything that had nowhere else to go, while still being used for tasks that required water close to home. This overlap of necessity created a reality that modern thinking struggles to separate, because in that world, the same systems that supported life also carried what life left behind. Nothing was strictly divided into clean and unclean spaces in the way we understand them now. Instead, everything existed on a gradient shaped by use, distance, and time. Even the architecture reflected this condition. Buildings were constructed close together not because people preferred density, but because safety required proximity. Streets were narrow because space inside the walls was limited, and expansion outward was controlled by risk rather than design. Within these constraints, daily routines adapted in ways that made the environment feel less chaotic to those who lived inside it, even if it remained unchanged in structure. People learned which paths were less affected by buildup, which corners cleared faster after rain, which times of day offered slightly better conditions for movement. Knowledge of the city was not just geographic, it was temporal and sensory, built from repeated exposure rather than maps or measurements. Yet, even with this adaptation, there remained areas where the limits of control became visible. Wind shifted unpredictably between buildings, carrying mixed conditions from one district to another. Seasonal changes altered everything at once, sometimes making the city feel temporarily more open, other times compressing all its conditions into tighter, heavier presence. In colder months, smoke lingered longer. In warmer months, organic decay became more noticeable. These were not disruptions to normal life. They were part of its rhythm, accepted not because they were ignored, but because they could not be separated from survival itself. And within this acceptance, something subtle emerged in how people perceived their surroundings. Over time, The city stopped being experienced as a collection of individual sensations and became instead a continuous background state, something the mind no longer processed in full detail unless it changed suddenly. This is where the deeper transformation happened, not in the environment itself, but in the way it was registered by those who lived within it, raising a question that no one in medieval Edinburgh would have framed directly, but everyone understood in practice: how much of what they called normal was actually the result of adaptation to something that could never truly be escaped. The moment you began to understand medieval Edinburgh was the moment you realized that no one inside it was thinking about the city as a single problem to be solved. Life did not organize itself around fixing the environment. It organized itself around functioning within it, and that distinction changed everything about how people experienced what outsiders would call unbearable. What you called a constant presence, they called conditions, and conditions were simply the starting point of every decision. A household did not ask how to remove the weight of the city from its walls. It asked how to cook, sleep, work, and pray inside it without losing rhythm. This is why the idea of escaping the smell was never part of daily language. Escape implied a boundary that could be crossed, a step outside into something fundamentally different, but for most residents there was no such step available. The city was enclosed by stone and geography, and everything within those limits shared the same air, the same water sources, and the same cycles of use and return. Even movement through the city reinforced this continuity. A person walking from home to market passed through layers of activity that overlapped without separation. A baker's heat drifted into the street where a tanner worked nearby. Animals moved through corridors of space that were also used by people carrying goods, water, and materials. Nothing was isolated long enough to become entirely distinct. Over time, this overlap created a form of perception that adapted rather than resisted. The human mind, when exposed to constant repetition, begins to filter what does not change, allowing attention to focus on what does. In medieval Edinburgh, what changed was not the background of the city but the moments within it, and so people learned to navigate life by noticing shifts rather than constants. A sudden change in wind direction mattered more than the overall atmosphere. A fresh arrival of goods at the market mattered more than the presence that never left. Even the passage of time was measured through variation in activity rather than improvement in conditions. Morning and evening were not cleaner or clearer states of the city. They were different intensities of the same environment. Yet beneath this adaptation, the structure of the city continued to accumulate its own history, layer upon layer of use that never fully reset. Stone absorbed smoke. Wood absorbed moisture. Earth absorbed everything that filtered downward through streets and courtyards. And because there was no system designed to separate these layers from daily life, they remained part of it, slowly reshaping how each generation experienced the same streets in ways that were almost invisible to those living through them. A child growing up in the city would not describe it as overwhelming, because overwhelming implies comparison to something else. Instead, it would simply be the first and only version of the world they learned to recognize. And so the question of adaptation becomes deeper than comfort or endurance. It becomes a question of perception itself. How long can a human mind remain inside a single environment before it stops recognizing that anything else is possible? And what happens when that environment is the only reality it has ever known? But there was a limit to what adaptation could hide, and it revealed itself not in dramatic moments, but in the small failures of expectation that never fully resolved. The human mind does not only learn to ignore what remains constant, it also builds assumptions about what should happen next. And in medieval Edinburgh, those assumptions were shaped entirely by repetition without improvement. A child might expect the street outside to feel the same each morning, and in most cases it did, but when change occurred it rarely arrived as something clean or separate. It came as a shift in intensity, a slight thickening of air after rain, a stronger presence of smoke when fires burned longer in colder weeks, or a heavier stillness when wind stopped moving through the narrow corridors between buildings. These changes were subtle, but they mattered because they broke the pattern the mind depended on to organize experience. Adults recognized them immediately not because they were trained to, but because survival depended on noticing differences in a world that rarely offered relief. Yet even this awareness did not create distance from the environment. It only deepened familiarity with its limits. People learned that improvement was not a natural expectation of the city, and so they stopped waiting for it. Instead, they built routines that assumed permanence, not progress. Water would always require effort to collect. Air would always carry the trace of what had come before. Movement would always involve passing through shared, crowded space where boundaries between activities were never fully defined. In this way, life became less about changing conditions and more about managing exposure to them. A person did not think in terms of escaping the city because escape implied that somewhere else was fundamentally different, and for most residents that idea had no practical meaning. Surrounding regions beyond the walls were not cleaner or simpler, only less concentrated. Even nature outside the city held its own challenges of weather, terrain, and distance, which meant that comparison did not offer comfort, only variation. And so medieval Edinburgh existed as a closed system of experience, not because it was isolated in the modern sense, but because every path of movement eventually returned to the same constraints. Over time, this created a quiet transformation in how people understood their own senses. What once might have been perceived as overwhelming became background, and what once demanded attention became expected silence in the mind. This was not a loss of awareness, but a reorganization of it, where survival required filtering rather than reacting. Still, beneath that adaptation, there remained a deeper truth that no amount of familiarity could erase. The city did not become lighter, cleaner, or easier to live in. It simply became the only world that existed, and within that world, every breath, every step, and every moment of stillness carried the weight of a place that never once stopped being exactly what it was. The city did not change its nature in response to how people adapted to it, but over time it began to reveal another layer that sat beneath daily perception, a layer that was not immediately visible until something interrupted the rhythm of acceptance. In medieval Edinburgh, that interruption rarely came as a single dramatic event. It arrived instead as accumulation becoming noticeable, when the weight of constant exposure reached a threshold where the mind could no longer fully filter it out. This did not happen often, but when it did, it usually occurred in moments of transition, such as seasonal shifts when rain patterns changed or cold periods forced people into tighter indoor spaces where air circulation became even more limited. Inside those confined spaces, what had always been present in the background of life became harder to ignore, not because it had grown stronger in isolation, but because proximity reduced the mind's ability to distance itself from it. This is where the invisible system of survival became most apparent. Every household in the city relied on the same basic structure of resources and limitations. Water was not delivered through hidden channels, but carried directly from its source, meaning its quality depended entirely on distance, effort, and timing. The same was true for materials used in cooking, cleaning, and trade, all of which passed through environments that were shared and reused continuously. Nothing entered or left the city without interacting with the same conditions that shaped every other aspect of life. Even fire, which provided warmth and light, contributed to the shared atmosphere rather than separating from it, because the smoke it produced became part of the same circulating environment that filled streets and interiors alike. Over time, this created a system in which distinction between outside and inside became less meaningful than the difference between movement and stillness. When air moved, it carried variation. When it settled, it reinforced continuity. People learned to read these shifts instinctively, not as abstract knowledge, but as practical awareness tied to survival. A sudden change in airflow inside a narrow dwelling could indicate weather changes outside. A shift in activity patterns in the streets could signal market cycles or social gatherings. Life was organized around interpreting these subtle variations rather than eliminating their source, because elimination was not within reach. What modern thinking might classify as environmental problem solving was in reality an ongoing negotiation with permanence. The city did not offer a version of itself that was free from these conditions, so people built a framework of behavior that assumed their presence as constant. This assumption shaped everything from how spaces were used to how time was structured within the day. There was no expectation that conditions would reset or clear, only that they would shift slightly from one moment to the next. And within that framework, something important emerged about the nature of perception itself. The human mind does not experience environments in full detail at all times. It constructs a working model based on what is necessary for action. In medieval Edinburgh, that model had to be unusually efficient because the environment provided too much constant input for full awareness to remain useful. So attention narrowed not out of ignorance, but out of necessity. What remained was a filtered reality, shaped by repetition and survival, where the city was no longer something observed from the outside, but something continuously processed from within. And in that continuous processing, the boundary between what was normal and what was simply endured began to disappear entirely. And yet, even within this carefully built system of adaptation, there existed moments when the city revealed that it was not merely a neutral environment to be managed, but an active force shaping the limits of what human life could tolerate without question. These moments did not announce themselves as crises. They appeared first as subtle friction between expectation and reality, where the mind, trained to accept continuity, encountered a situation that resisted easy categorization. In medieval Edinburgh, this often happened in places where different systems of life overlapped too closely to remain invisible to each other. The market was one such place, not because it was exceptional, but because it concentrated everything the city contained into a single shared space. Here, goods arrived from surrounding regions and were handled in open-air conditions that changed constantly with weather and activity. The same surfaces that supported trade in the morning might be used for different purposes later in the day, not through formal transformation, but through continuous reuse. What mattered was not cleanliness in a modern sense, but functionality within existing limits. People did not evaluate the city by how separate or controlled its elements were, but by whether daily routines could still proceed without interruption. This created a perception of stability that depended entirely on predictability of access, rather than predictability of conditions. If water could be reached, if food could be obtained, if shelter remained intact, then the system was considered intact. Everything else existed outside the category of urgent concern. Yet beneath this surface logic, the environment continued to accumulate complexity that no single household or institution fully managed. Weather interacted with architecture. Architecture shaped airflow. Airflow influenced how spaces were experienced, and human movement redistributed everything continuously without ever removing it. Over time, this created a feedback loop between environment and behavior where each reinforced the other without resolution. People adapted not by changing the system, but by narrowing the range of what they expected from it. This narrowing of expectation had consequences that were not immediately visible to those living within it. It shaped memory, attention, and even language, because experiences that never changed did not require naming in detail. What remained unnamed slowly became invisible to conscious thought, even while still being physically present. This is why descriptions from later observers often emphasize conditions that residents themselves would not have highlighted, not because those conditions were hidden, but because they were no longer processed as separate features of life. Within this framework, survival was not a matter of escaping difficulty, but of integrating it into routine until it no longer required active recognition. And in that integration, the city achieved a kind of permanence that was not physical stability, but psychological acceptance of constraint. The deeper implication of this was not that people stopped noticing their environment, but that they stopped expecting it to become anything other than what it already was. And in that acceptance, medieval Edinburgh ceased to be understood as a place one lived within, and became instead the baseline through which all experience was measured. But beneath this quiet acceptance, there remained a deeper layer that could not be fully absorbed into routine, because it was not about discomfort alone, but about the way limits gradually define what a human life becomes. In medieval Edinburgh, people did not experience this limit as a single visible barrier. They experienced it as repetition across generations, where each new life began inside the same environmental constraints and slowly learned to interpret them as normal. Over time, this created a kind of inherited certainty, not spoken but lived, that the city would always be this way and could only ever be managed, never fundamentally changed. This certainty shaped behavior in ways that extended far beyond individual perception. Decisions about where to build, where to walk, where to gather, and where to remain were all influenced by conditions that had existed long before any one person arrived and would continue long after they left. The city therefore functioned less like a place being actively designed and more like a structure of accumulated responses, where each generation added adjustments without removing the underlying foundation that required them. What makes this particularly significant is not the presence of hardship itself, but the absence of any reference point outside of it. Without a contrasting environment to measure against, the human mind does not interpret conditions as extreme, it interprets them as complete. This completeness does not mean satisfaction, it means finality, a sense that experience has no missing layer waiting to be discovered. Within such a framework, even imagination becomes constrained, because imagination draws from what has been seen or experienced, and what has never been encountered cannot easily be conceived. In medieval Edinburgh, this meant that the boundaries of the city were not only physical but cognitive, shaping not just how people moved, but how they thought about movement itself. Yet even in this state of apparent closure, life continued to generate small variations that prevented total uniformity. A change in season, a shift in trade patterns, or the arrival of unfamiliar visitors could temporarily disrupt the equilibrium of expectation, reminding those within the city that their version of normal was not universal, only habitual. These moments did not transform the structure of life, but they revealed its flexibility, showing that adaptation was not a final state, but an ongoing process. Still, once the disruption passed, the system returned to its established rhythm, and the mind returned with it, settling back into patterns that required less effort to maintain. And so the city persisted not because it resolved its limitations, but because it learned how to function entirely within them, creating a form of continuity that was sustained not by change, but by the quiet endurance of everything that never changed at all. And then, as if the city itself understood the need for continuity, everything returned to its familiar shape. The same streets that had carried generations of movement continued to carry it. The same narrow passages between buildings remained the channels through which life passed. The same rhythms of labor, water, fire, and trade resumed without interruption, as if nothing had ever been questioned at all. Yet something subtle had changed, not in the city, but in the awareness of it. Because once a system has been seen as something constructed from repeated constraint, it can no longer be experienced with complete innocence. Even when the mind returns to adaptation, it carries with it the faint memory of structure beneath normality. In medieval Edinburgh, this awareness did not transform daily life into something different, but it added a second layer of perception that existed quietly beneath routine. People continued to move through their days as they always had, yet the understanding of what those days were made of had shifted in ways that could not be reversed. The city remained unchanged in its physical reality, but it was no longer entirely invisible to those who understood its logic. And within that understanding, a final realization emerges, not as a conclusion spoken aloud, but as a pattern recognized after prolonged exposure. What defines a place like this is not any single condition, nor any specific limitation, but the total absence of an alternative within lived experience. The environment becomes complete not because it is perfect, but because it is total, enclosing every aspect of life within its own boundaries until those boundaries are no longer perceived as edges at all. In such a world, escape is not a physical possibility that has been denied, but a concept that never fully forms in the mind to begin with. The city does not hold its people in place through force in the visible sense, but through continuity so complete that the idea of elsewhere dissolves before it can become actionable thought. And so the final truth of medieval Edinburgh is not found in its streets or its structures or even in the conditions that define it, but in the way those conditions shape what can be imagined beyond them. When every breath, every movement, and every perception is formed within a single uninterrupted environment, that environment ceases to be something lived inside and becomes instead the framework through which reality itself is understood. And in that moment of recognition, the smell, the stone, the smoke, and the narrow streets are no longer separate details of a distant world, but part of a continuous system of life that once existed not as an exception to history, but as the only version of reality its inhabitants had ever known.